Hi, welcome to another episode of Dirk and Swap conversations on open source. Dirk, today we are going to talk about scalability of open source project. If you look at open source, I just want to go just a bit basic that why we do open source is like it's more or less like it starts with scratching your own itch. You come up with some solution, and then you see there are people who are facing the same challenges or problem, and you want to help them out. So you put your code out there so that they can use it. But when they make some changes and improvement, you want to take advantage of that, and that's how the whole ball of open source start rolling. But as more and more people start using the code, they also want to make changes to it to better suit it to their own needs. They want to become active contributors to that project. And the chemistry starts changing now because as the project grows, while code still remains important, what becomes even more important is finding ways to collaborate on that code so that you can help each other as well as you can learn from each other. Uh, I think that the management of a project can be handled easily when there are only few users and few contributors. But once the project grows, its user base grows, its contributors grows beyond 1,000, that's when the real challenge starts. And also when the contributors include individual as well as powerful companies, you do need to maintain a balance. And I feel that we have been seeing a lot of projects. That's where the culture, the policies, the nature of the project changes because it no longer remains scratch your own itch. If it is not handled properly, it can become an itch in itself. So Dirk, you have you have seen so many projects from the very early on, and personally, you are involved with Subsurface. So you have seen projects of different scale. What I want to understand when we talk about scale is that what really means, or what are the indicators that tells that this project needs to scale. Like for example, there can be a Linux distribution, right? It may be serving a million users, but it doesn't need a million contributors. There may be only 10 core contributors, and not everybody is interested in that. At the same time, there may be some other project where the contributors are as active as users. And so what I want to understand from you is, can you just talk about when does the problem or challenge of scalability arises? What are the indicators?
So I think that is actually a very good summary of the underlying problem space, because when we look at projects and we look at project scale, it's very easy to try and have a single axis on which you measure a project. You say a small project, a big project, a huge project. But that's not really how projects work. That's not really how we need to think about open source communities. You started out saying, scratch your own itch, you solve something, you post it so that other people can use it. That's one typical starting point for open source projects. Of course, these days we have a lot of projects started by companies where the starting point is very different, where you already assign a team, where you already start working on this with a much more thought through goal and much more of a roadmap behind it. But when you look at the different aspects of size of open source projects, to me, it's the size of the developer community. How many people are involved? We have projects that are a single developer, or maybe a single developer who occasionally gets a few patches from the outside. We have a lot of projects that are a handful of developers. And then we have the likes of Linux and Kubernetes with thousands and tens of thousands developers. So that is one dimension of scale. The other dimension of scale is the size of your code base that you're looking at. Do you have something that is very small, very simple, very dense, just solves one problem, solves it well? Do you have a project that is, reasonably sized, few 10,000 lines of code? Or again, do you have one of these monsters, hundreds, millions of lines of code? I can't recall. Linux is approaching or maybe even surpassed 20 million lines of code. Holy moly. And then, of course, the other thing that you mentioned, this whole idea of how big is your user base? Do you have a project that has a few users because it's very specific, very narrow to solve a problem that not a lot of people have? Do you have a project that has hundreds, thousands of users? Or do you have a project that has millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of users? And that may sound outlandish, but again, look at the Linux kernel. Every Android phone has the Linux kernel in it. So there are literally hundreds of millions of users of this project. And in none of these individual metrics, there is a hard point where you say, here suddenly scale becomes a problem. It's always a gradient. It's always a change where the problems pile up. And at some point you get to the point where you realize that you have a problem. And that's really the point that I thought we should be talking about today.
Right. Also, when you do mention user base, code base, or contributor base, from tech point of view, if you look at the code base, I think the code base of Linux, I think it just runs in Linus's basement or somewhere. That's where he has the machines that run. I mean, because with open source, what happens is that other than offering it through the GitHub repository where people can download the code, you don't have the same challenge of, let's say VMware Cloud or AWS Cloud, where suddenly users during a holiday season are buying a lot of things, so you have to worry about scaling your code. But the challenge from like, let's say there are so many users, right? And they want to get their changes into the code base. Because the user base is growing, everybody wants to say, hey, you know what? I want this there, I want this there. At the same time, maybe a project is serving just a massive community, like the user base maybe in China, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in India. Now you also have to worry about being culturally sensitive, because you are a scaling project in that dimension as well, the diversity of the user base. And then the third aspect is the governance that we talked about last time, that since you have so many users, how do you make sure that that every user get the particular kind of representation? So I feel that technology is not a big challenge. Most of these companies, they offer infrastructure, so there is like problem of infrastructure, and then there is a problem of managing the project itself. So which one becomes critical there?
So it's interesting what you said, because in the way you describe the interdependency between users and developers, you almost show some of your assumptions swap. Because you talk about as you have more users, you have more people who want to contribute. Let me push back on this. Let's say you are Android and you have hundreds of millions of people with an Android phone. But the vast majority, I would say 99.99, many 9%, don't want to contribute to that code base. They just want a working phone. So you have that intermediary, the people who want to sell them the phone, who want to sell apps on the phone, who want to provide services through the phone. Those people suddenly become the new contributors. And as the user base grows, the contributor base grows, because it's that indirect dependency. On the flip side, you look at something like Kubernetes, where the users tend to be IT operations teams who really are likely to be sending patches or to employ developers who want to improve certain things, add certain features. And so the nature of your project, what your project does, who it speaks to, who its interested parties, its stakeholders are, really impacts how your user base growing and your developer base growing are related to each other. But you actually ended with a question. The question was about that interesting difference between, is scale a challenge from the infrastructure, or is scale a challenge from just the social interaction between developers, going back to the governance conversation we had 2 weeks ago? And I think the answer is, most of the infrastructure challenges today we know how to solve. GitHub itself, Git, the invention of the project by Linus 16 years ago, and the infrastructure that GitHub has provided afterwards have solved a large part of the infrastructure challenge. Now the challenges go into your CI/CD pipeline, how you deliver packages, how do you make it installable, how do you deliver translations, how do you deliver all these ancillary things. But the much bigger challenges typically are not in the infrastructure. They are in creating a leadership structure. They're creating an interaction between the developers and the users, between the various interested parties here that work. But this is not just a community conversation, because the real challenge now comes in the interaction of these two parts. Because initially you start out with a small group of developers who control the infrastructure. And as that runs out of scale, out of scope, as this team, this initial infrastructure is no longer capable to serve the user base, to serve the developer base, to serve a code base of this size, to use my 3 dimensions, now you need to make change. And every change, every inflection point, every time your project changes fundamentally in ways that changes the infrastructure, changes the way collaboration happens, that to me are these breaking points. When you suddenly say, oh, it's not the one developer who maintains my Git repository, who does the builds and who puts it all together. That doesn't work anymore. We now need to have a team. We need to have more people. We need to use different tools. Those really are the moments where projects can fail, and where suddenly that scale of the project breaks some of the things that previously made the project work.
So it's also more or less like, as you said, that the relationship also changed, because it's not just one contributor and the 5 initial contributors. They were also hanging out, being friends, and they understand each other very well. As you scale, as the team grows and the management grows, I feel that there are so many friends in the open source community, but as new people keep coming in, when I go out and hang out, I don't know about you, because your involvement is a bit different, because you're insider, you all also contribute to a lot of projects. I am more or less like an outsider, where I sit down and monitor the project. But I do feel that some projects, the chemistry within the project also changes. I'm not saying it changes for good or bad, but I look at the project and it's not the same project that was there 3 years ago. I don't want to name any certain project, but with the scale, it also changes the whole nature of the project as well. Have you felt that ever? And
Very much so. I think that is something that you will really run into. And that is one of those defining moments. When I talk about the inflection points, as your project changes, your ability to retain the value of the initial team, the spirit, those friendships, but also allow new people in, bring in more points of view, let's be serious, make the team more diverse, bring in people who are different from you. So it happens just this morning, I was on a preparation call for a presentation for the Embedded Linux conference about 10 years of the Yocto project. And so those of us who were around 10 years ago to start the project got on a Zoom call and had a little chat and shared some anecdotes and went through, what do we want to do with this 10 years of this big successful project? And it was such a reminder that it was initially a fairly homogeneous group of people. And this group of people have remained friends, but they have been immensely successful in bringing in new points of view, bringing in new people, bringing in people who have completely different goals, completely different ideas, and having that project grow to embrace these people and give them the ability to do the things that they wanted to do, have the infrastructure grow, have the capabilities of the project grow to make it welcoming to more people. That's a small example, but that's an example that very much reflects the risks that you go through or that you encounter as a project grows. And because I don't want to say as you grow the project, because that's not an initiative that a single entity can do. It requires a group of people coming together. And the changes can be helpful and healthy and make the project bigger and better, but they can also be very disruptive. They can show breaking points. They can show personality conflicts. They can show your inability to deal with the loss of control. They can show that some of your basic assumptions in your project actually didn't scale with the size of the community that you're building. And just like you said a moment ago, I don't want to diss on projects because that's unfair. That's unfair to the people involved. But I think many of us can think of projects that were super hot 5-6 years ago and that failed to be successful in living up to that scale and bringing in the people and making the people successful, allowing them to insert their point of view in the project. And they stayed with a fairly close and set in their views set of leadership that didn't grow with the project. And that's where the scale can become dangerous to you.
Right. Also, when you mention fear of, the creators of the project from being a project run by or managed by a group of people who become friends, family friends, hanging out together, versus suddenly you look at a project which looks more or less like a corporate environment. There is code of conduct, there are policies, there are governance. You cannot do this, you cannot do that. And there are a lot of people you don't even interact with often. So that fear may be there with a lot of creators of the project. At the same time, a lot of time, these people's projects, when we get involved with, we are passionate about it. Versus it becomes we get paid during the daytime. So the passion that we had where we're sitting, no matter where we're sitting, even on a napkin, we are writing about the code or whatever, versus 9 to 5, it's done. So scalability brings that challenge as well, because from passionate people to work for pay people. So, sometimes those fears in the minds of founders, because that's why some projects still try to keep those projects under their own control versus giving it out. Because you are involved with soft surface and you don't want to hand over actually Linus handed over to you, so he trusted you, but lighter mode and a bit serious tone, how genuine are those fears and how to overcome it so that you continue to serve the community that you created the project for? Does it make sense?
It makes perfect sense, but there is a few things that you mentioned that I want to question a little bit. So you create this difference between someone who's enthusiastic and really committed and someone who does it as part of their job. I would say there are a lot of people who are being paid to work on open source and who are super enthusiastic and work a lot more than 9 to 5 and are really committed to a project.
No, I agree with you. I don't want to interrupt you, but I agree with you. What I'm saying is that there are people who find the job that pay them to do this work. We love. That's why I picked this. When I work, my wife says you're working all the time. I feel like, what? I'm never working. I'm just having fun. Talking to you is not. So there are a lot of people, smart people, who find the job so that they can continue to do what they would either way do in their free time, in their basement. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about when you talk about scale, right? When you're talking about 1,000 people working on the code base, not everybody, there are a lot of people who are still working on, you have to understand, there are a lot of people who are passionate, but there is a bigger community which are just doing for their job. So what I'm asking is that while I do agree with you partially, but I also agree there are a lot of people who do it just for the sake of job. They move to a different company. For a lot of guys, they move company, but they continue to work on the same project. I have so many friends and you're still working on Linux? Yeah, but you're working on your 5th company. At the same time, there are a lot of people who just switch job. It was just another job for them. So the fear is that, hey, that's what I'm asking.
So that's actually very true. You run into people over and over again, and they are on their 5th employer and they're still working on the same project. In my team at VMware, there happened to be a few people who in the past worked with me at Intel. It's pure coincidence, of course. And realistically, there are different types of developers, but that is also a function of growing your developer base. And to me, that is not as much about corporate versus non-corporate, but it's just about the personalities that you bring in, because you can bring in the people who are super enthusiastic and committed to your project, and they come in because they work for a company that wants them to work on this. And you can find the same type of people in a hobby project. And you can find the people who do this for a few weeks until something they care about is solved and you never see them again. So I think this is much more a distinction in the personality type of developers. There is a distinction in whether they're hobbyists or or paid developers. But you highlight an important problem, because as your developer base grows, automatically the breadth of people, the type of people that you have involved will grow, and you will get all of the different types. You will get, toxic people. You will get people that are really hard to work with. You will get people who are enthusiastic and engaged and super positive, and everything in between. And as part of that, growth of your project, scale of your project means that the community leadership, the infrastructure needs to be able to deal with these people, make them successful, integrate them into the project. Earlier, you mentioned as one of the milestones, the hallmark of growth, is the introduction of what you described as a more corporate structure, and you mentioned the code of conduct. I think codes of conduct should be a totally normal thing. A project should have one. And I think that a structure that feels more corporate is typically just a result of having more developers. Because you cannot have a just everyone do whatever they want structure if you have hundreds, maybe thousands of people working on a project. You need more structure, more planning, more integration, more framework around that. But that's exactly this inflection point that I'm talking about. And so if you are part of a project that sees an influx of developer, a growth of one or two of these axes of scale, one of the important things to do is to take a step back and get together with whatever is your definition of a core team, the key developers, the founders, the most active people, the people who have a vested interest in your project, and talk about what are the consequences of this growth. How are we going to actively deal with it? Don't fall behind. Don't let the flow of code, the flow of users, the flow of developers overwhelm you and force you into decisions that you haven't thought through. Instead, look at your project, analyze what's happening, and be honest with yourself. So you will go through phases where your developer base is shrinking. That's something that I'm experiencing right now in Subsurface, with fewer people really actively contributing. And you ask yourself, how do I deal with that? How do I make changes to make it more fun for people? And on the flip side, suddenly lots of people come in because of a presentation you gave somewhere, or an article that was written, or some other outside effect that suddenly brings in a lot of interest. How do you deal with that? Are your structures ready for that? Are you ready for success? So often I hear from projects, oh, I'll deal with that when I get to it. But often then it's too late. You have to have a plan as you see growth in your project of how you accommodate that. Again, in all three of the dimensions that I talked about.
Right. Also, what happens in most of the time, actually, I will just talk about code of conduct, because I was having a discussion with someone else the other day about diversity. And the fact is that there is always a code of conduct, no matter what. Like, for example, we all, I cannot say we all, but most of us have wives or girlfriends and kids, daughters. So we do behave appropriately in front of them. It's not the lawless word even in our houses. So there is nothing wrong in bringing that same to where we work. Like, for example, when I was in India and we would do a lot of LUGs, Linux user groups kind of thing, or we'll have friends there. It's not like, hey, we are working on this, electronics thing. You can do whatever you want to do. No, mom is home, dad is home, so we cannot do X, Y, Z. There's always a code of conduct, no matter what setup you are in. So there's nothing wrong. I would actually love to have, but I think we are going to talk about it, but I would love to talk about code of conduct, because the reason I mention it is that sometimes people take it negatively. That is not the case. And sometimes I also try to play devil's advocate part. That is easier one, right? To challenge a notion versus speaking in favor of notion. But going back to the scalability part, what I do want to say is that sometimes, I don't want to name anybody, and it is just a general, I'm not making a specific accusation on anybody. Sometimes people fear losing control over their baby. At the same time, they are not trained to deal with people, and they're not trained as a manager. So all they knew was to create a project and I can work with 4 people. Is there any time and place? I think there is time and place where the best way to do is step out of your role and let someone else come in who can manage your project in a much better way than you do. But the important thing here is to realize what is important to you, the project or your control over the project.
But that's exactly what I meant as well. When I talk about this idea of taking a step back and thinking about what is my vision here, how are we going to deal with change? This requires an active, conscious act on the part of the maintainer or the founders of a project to be honest with themselves and say, am I the right person to run this? Are we the right group to run this? Do we need to bring in additional people to strengthen us? Or are there people in here who, through their personality, maybe would be better off if they took a step back and focused on code and had somebody else run the project? We've seen many, many examples of that. We've seen forks where projects suddenly have a subset of the community that says, we can't deal with the leadership. They are not listening to us. They are being abusive. They are making mistakes. They're doing things the way that we disagree with, and they fork the project. That's a very natural thing to happen in open source. And we've seen a number of very big projects where this happened during their lifetime. If you look at the X Windows system, if you look at the GCC compiler suite, we've had large forks and then often recombinations later, or the original project dies and the fork survives. And so this is something where the community response to the growth is really an indicator of the likelihood of success. If you as a community embrace that change and proactively look at what you need to do for your scale, more users, more contributors, more code, and you respond to this with openness to change and with the willingness to listen to people and with the willingness to make changes to the way in which you do things, your likelihood of success goes up dramatically. And those people who say, no, it's my way or the highway, and this is the one way we are going to do this, and the one infrastructure you're allowed to use, and the one use case model that I'm willing to consider, those projects are likely at some point just going to falter, to fail, to fade into the background. And there are many examples for either of those two outcomes. And the other thing to keep in mind is, while I generalize here a lot and I talk a lot about things that I've seen in my experience, for most every one of these examples, there are outliers. There are examples where, despite all the challenges and despite all the mistakes being made, the projects are still successful. So this is a very multidimensional, very complex environment where easy answers aren't often what you're looking for. But in my experience, being open to change, listening to the people involved, and paying attention to how the interaction in your project works as more people, more code is involved, that really is one of those key indicators of success. Not find out about an inflection point long after it happened, but prepare for it, be ready for it, and have strategies how to overcome them. And one of the things here is there are organizations who are out there trying to help you. Very often we talk about, and this is something we talked about last time as well in the context of open governance. Some of the foundations that are out there are trying to create automated, turnkey, low-touch solutions that help you grow your project, grow your infrastructure, establish a code of conduct, establish better communication mechanisms, establish very easy ways to control the IP of your project as a team, not as an individual, and make it easier to create a scalable, not just software infrastructure, but community project infrastructure that allows you to survive that scale and be successful through that scale. And to me, that is an aspect that a lot of projects don't want to think about, but a lot more projects should think about.
Right. I'm just trying to be an idealist and a fiction writer. I was watching Away, Netflix series Away, and there was a point where there was so much conflict within the. I don't know if you've seen it or not. It's a very good show. So basically, there's astronauts. They had a lot of conflict, and it was more about politics, internal politics. of course, the world politics. And then they ask, just go back when you're a child, why you wanted to become an astronaut. So similarly, just go back and think when you took the first contribution or when you put your code out there and the first person responded and how you felt. What drove you back then? Just go back to that moment. So don't worry about losing control over your project, because power corrupts. Just because you have a big community now, you want to control, just go back to that moment when you share your code, the excitement that you felt then when the first person contributed and said, hey, that code is good, can I use it? And then they send a patch and then you use it. That was the core of open source collaboration. That's what I feel.
You're absolutely right. There is this underlying assumption that if you do open source, that you open sourced your project because you wanted to bring more people together. You wanted to share what you've done. And I always am surprised about people who are focused on this notion of control in an open source project. Because frankly, for the projects that I maintain, if somebody else comes in and seems to be doing a better job than I do, and he or she wants to take over, more power to you. Fantastic. I want better people than me involved. And so I happily give up any sense of control for parts or all of the code, because if it makes the project better, it serves my initial goal to have this project out there and have it be successful and have it help people. So to me, this fear of losing control is weird. What I do care about is the health of the project. What is the right thing for the project? And so, again, talking about subsurface, Linus is still involved. And Linus gets far more involved in this project whenever we're talking about things that are critical to the health of the project, to the longevity of the project, to the ability to serve a large user base. And that's where he really cares. And frankly, that's where I really care. And so if you see the more heated discussions on the developer mailing lists, they're almost always about maintainability, scalability into more platform, making it likely that this project can be successful for many more years. And that's very much the conversations that we've had at the Linux Kernel Summit for 2 decades. How can we make this scale? How can we deal with more developers, more companies, more users, more use cases, more platforms? It's a very consistent set of concerns at various sizes, at various stages in the project. And it's something that the projects that think about those, the projects that plan for those, the projects that are conscious of those, that go in and say, oh, look, we are reaching a type of growth, we're reaching a scale where we need to make changes, where we need to respond to this growth in a way that continues to make us successful, attractive, useful, to give us a perspective into a path into the future. And that's really why I wanted to talk about project scale, because that is this wake-up call that you need to listen to and not wait until it's too late.